Welcome everyone to my live streams. This is going to be a four-part series where we go over Nautobot plugin development. It's taking the same stream essentially that I did a few weeks ago, but I'm going to break it into smaller bite-sized chunks so you're not sitting here for 2 hours straight listening to me ramble on my soapbox. Today's goal is going to be setting up your development environment. We're not actually going to be going through and creating any models today or any views or APIs or migrations or anything from that standpoint. We're just going to be getting our Nautobot instance up and going. We're going to create our base package for our stream, but we're not actually going to do anything with our package today. So just to recap, goal is just to get Nautobot up and going and get a base package set up to where that we can actually see the plugin is installed inside of Nautobot. So before I even get into that, what I'm going to go over a few of the my personal environment dependencies and how I have things set up. I use VS Code with a remote SSH plugin. That gives me the ability to have a true Linux development environment without having to worry about running Docker desktop on my local machine. I'm a very big proponent of Docker containers. We're not going to be using Docker containers for the development environment. We will be using Docker containers for the dependencies, and I'll get into that in a second. But the biggest thing behind that is this is also my personal dev box that I have some other services up and going on it. I use a Nginx process to do SNI encapsulation. So I am going to be running TLS on this box, but you don't have to run TLS. I'm also running, like I said, I'm going to be running my dependencies inside of Docker Compose. So you'll see I have a simple Docker Compose file, pulling in my Postgres 13 from Alpine, doing a Docker volume, not a host volume mount, but just a normal Docker volume into a varlib Postgres data. I'm only exposing 5432, so the default Postgres port on localhost only, so I'm not exposing it for any type of outbound connection. Then we'll see the same Redis information, sourcing from a .env file, and then also pulling in our default port for Redis. Jump into settings. I'm a big proponent of using formatters on my Python code, just so that as soon as I'm saving something, it's automatically formatting it for me, and I'm not going to be fighting with CI later whenever I implement CI. So black on save has been the biggest help for me. And then this is just my simple reverse proxy setup that is going to be redirecting my nautobot.whitej6.com. Whitej6 is a domain that I own, and I'm hosting everything in AWS for my public facing stuff, but my internal is just using a wildcard cert on my development box that is pointing to star.whitej6.com. And this is specifically going to be looking at the Nautobot service. I've got other services running, but this is the specific one. And we're going to be doing a proxy pass to localhost on 8000. So like I mentioned, you don't have to use TLS. Just wanted to talk through some of the things that I have running locally on my machine to understand why I actually have TLS, why I'm having a DNS resolution, and all these whys behind that are there. If we come up and we take a look, here's the URL that we're working with, see nautobot.whitej6.com. If I restart it, or I'm sorry, refresh it, we'll see that I just get 502 bad gateway error. So Nginx is set up and it's working correctly. It's trying to reverse proxy back to the Nautobot service running on port 8000, but since nothing is running, Nginx is returning back a 502 gateway, a bad gateway error. Our code and everything is going to be based off of the plugin development. So the plugins for Nautobot are, for the most part, essentially just a Django application. So a lot of what we're going to be seeing and doing over the next couple days is building essentially a self-contained Django app that is going to be pulling in some really fun and easy extendable solutions from the upstream code. And so what I mean by upstream code is there are view sets and base models and these base functionalities that are built out of the box by Nautobot that we're going to pull from there instead of pulling from the base Django and then building our additional stuff on top of that. That's going to give us the ability to have a lot lower code in our development and not having to go through and reinvent all the wheels that are invented by default out of the box from Nautobot. One of those is with Nautobot, we've taken the approach of instead of using an the auto incrementing integer for the primary key on all the models, so using a UUID. That just gives you the ability to potentially prevent against an enumeration attack. So these are all going to be based off UUIDs, but I don't want to have to go back and look at every single model that I develop and make sure that I enforce the use of a UUID for the primary key, or ID is the specific attribute on the model. So by pulling from these upstream code, I'm going to be getting those UUID fields by default for my ID. I'm going to get a lot of these moving parts, like I said, so I don't have to worry about defining as much code as possible. So back to kind of the dependencies and how I work in my local environment. Like I mentioned, I've got Docker. I'm using it to run my dependent services, so I can run Postgres or Redis, and really any dependent service on it. If you were running this locally and you wanted to not use containers, all you have to do is just make sure that you have Postgres set up and Postgres installed and is listening on localhost and has the appropriate credentials exposed. Sorry, not Postgres wouldn't be exposing the credentials, but you know the credentials that I use to create your database. And same thing with Redis. I just like being able to use Docker to be able to quickly and easily orchestrate that. You'll also see that I'm using Docker Compose. One thing that'll keep you out of trouble is making sure that you're not necessarily installing Docker Compose from the pip install Docker Compose. If you go and look at the Docker Compose install instructions, especially for a Linux environment, there's a git Docker Compose script, and that is the preferred method for installing Docker Compose. Similarly, we will be using Poetry for our packaging solution, and that's another thing, that if you're using Poetry for your packaging solution, you need to make sure that you are doing it from the Git Poetry scripts, not from a pip install Poetry. And that's just going to make sure that for upgrades and support later on down the road, that you're not backing yourself into a corner, or you're not potentially setting yourself up for a fun time. All right, and then last, I've got some variables that are set up. I've got basically, you'll see that I've got a couple of these. So I've got my database user, database password, my Redis password. They're duplicated from what I have going on here. And the reason behind that is the items that are prefaced with Nautobot underscore, there are very specific os.environs or getting from environment variables that are coming out of the box with our Nautobot config that we'll generate in just a moment. And so instead of having to change those defaults, I'm just going to align with what's in the Nautobot config file. In theory, I could go into the Nautobot config file and I could specify my Postgres host, my Postgres. I could specify all this information inside of my Nautobot config file. Especially if I wanted to use the same environment variable, or I could hard code it. But I don't care to use the same environment variable, and I don't like hard coding anything. And then these bottom ones that are PostgreSDB and Redis, these are going to be automatically ingested by the underlying service on startup of the service to automatically create my Nautobot database inside of my host, creating it with the Nautobot user, and then a not very secure password for my password. So if we go ahead and get started, and I just may have to do this export twice. I think I have to do it twice because of Poetry. So we're going to export that. We'll do an env. We'll see I've got all my fun things are now injected into my environment variable. Let's do a Docker PS. So like I mentioned, I do have a couple underlying services that are already running. These are just things that I'm using locally in my environment. So we can see that those services are running Docker PS -a. Oh, look at that. Let's go ahead and do a Docker system prune. Let's be a good tenant of Docker, and let's clear up some of our stuff. Almost half a gig worth of stuff, so we're good. All right, so if we do an ls L, we'll see that I've got a Docker Compose file here. And if I do a Docker Compose up, and then I'm going to do a -d. So Docker Compose is managing my dependencies in a idempotent fashion. And so I'm only going to be bringing up services that I need to bring up. And then I'm going to do this in this detached mode. So I'm not going to be attaching to the TTY. My expected behavior is that I should be creating and actually I can go through and do a Docker volume less. So you can see I've got a bunch of different Docker volumes that are here for all different things. So I'm expecting there to be another Docker volume that's going to be coming in from my Compose project name. So it'll be live_stream_Postgres data. And actually, let's just go ahead and nuke that. That's already there. So let's do a Docker volume rm, and we're good to go. So we can do another Docker volume ls, and it's gone. Well, I should probably clean some of those up, but I'm lazy. All right, so we see that we no longer have the live stream Postgres data. So now my expected behavior is whenever I do a Docker Compose up -d, I should be able to look at my volumes and see that there's now a new Docker Compose volume for my Postgres information. That's just going to ensure that I have persistency with my database volumes inside of Postgres, so that if I spin it down and spin it back up, I'm not losing my data. And the next thing I'm expecting to happen is I should be getting a Postgres container and a Redis container listening on 5432 and 6379, only exposed to localhost. So we'll do Docker Compose up -d. We'll see that we created a Docker network for my specific Compose project. We'll see that we created the Postgres data volume, created a container for Redis, and a container for Postgres. So do a Docker PS. And we'll see that we've been up for about 15 seconds. We got our live stream Postgres and our Redis. I'll make that so it stays on one line. If we do a volume ls, we'll see that we now have the live stream Postgres data. So this is, for me, the quickest and easiest way of getting an instance of Postgres and Redis up and not having to worry about, okay, does this environment use this instance, or am I pointing to this one, or having to understand or worry what underlying environment I'm working with. You can see I've done a decent, like I've got local SSO for a couple things. I've got firewall. I've got a server, PG data, I've got a VIP tracker. I've got all these different instances of Nautobot databases. I'm not having to try and make sure I'm not stomping on one another and making sure that I'm not having difficulties with version mismatch or anything from that standpoint. So we've gone all the way around the world just to get our dependencies. So now let's go ahead and get our package set up. So what we'll do is we'll do a poetry new, and this is going to be Nautobot plugin IP range. So what we're going to do in our plugin is we're just going to create one simple model, and it's going to be for an IP range. So we're just going to be extending the data model for the ability to have an IP range within Nautobot. And so by doing a poetry new is we're telling poetry we're wanting to create a new package, and it's going to be called Nautobot plugin IP range. All right, so we can see here on the left-hand side inside of my live stream folder where I'm at. Don't care to do that. All right, we'll see that we now have a Nautobot plugin IP range. We see the same thing with underscores instead of dashes. So this is our this is going to be our package. We see that we now have a pyproject.toml, a readme.rst, and then a simple test directory. So fun things here. We're going to move this test directory into the actual package itself. The reason behind that is for Django to be able to pick it up when running our Nautobot tests. That's where it'll need to be. All right, so let's come in here and let's take a peek at our pyproject.toml file. So we have it's just very super simple. We see what our name is, version description, we got the author, we got our dependencies, and our poetry dev dependencies. Now I've got a little cheat sheet over on the side for me, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab all of my dev dependencies that I typically use. And so this is one thing that I typically am very anti and I don't do, and I tell people don't do it. It's not the right way to do it. But I personally am not a huge fan of editing the PyProject.toml file raw like this. I preach the gospel of using the poetry commands to create that. The reason why this is an exception to that expectation is we currently do not have a poetry.lock file. If we already had that poetry.lock file and I came in and I started messing with this PyProject.toml, I'm going to quickly get things out of sync, and I'd either have to do a relock or delete the lock file and recreate it. And if you forget to do that and you send it to CI, you're going to have a bad time. So this is just a one-off thing for initially bootstrapping and getting my project started. If I'm developing a new package, I'll go in and add my dependencies manually like this, or I could do a poetry add or a poetry install of underlying packages. So now let's go ahead and let's cd into that directory. So we're now at the appropriate level. So now let's -l. So cool, we see our pyproject.toml. And let's go ahead and let me see, I set this aside. Looking at one last thing. All right, so let's do a poetry install dash uppercase E for extras, and we're going to do Nautobot. I'm doing this a little bit different than some of my other projects. Let's see if this does exactly how I want. All right, up independent. That's not going to work the way I want it. That's all right. So let's just go ahead and do a poetry at Nautobot. And so by not specifying a specific version or any form of pinning whenever I'm doing my poetry add command, we'll see that it's just going to inherit from whatever the latest release version is, which is 1.1.4. And now we see that we have a poetry.lock file created. And it's going to have all of our information in here. So let's go ahead and do a poetry install. Oh, and I cheated. I had walked through these steps before we started and had already created my virtual environment. So Poetry's idempotent was able to detect that there was already a virtual environment that I had created using the same naming structure, the same folder structure. So what we can actually do, so let's do this. Let's just not cheat for once. So let's do an rm -rf cache poetry virtual environment, and this is going to be Nautobot plugin IP range. Cool. If I could type, it would be off to the races. We'll do a poetry install. So we'll see that we're not having to go through and do dependency resolution. Our dependency resolution was done whenever we did our poetry add of Nautobot. We'll see that we're coming through, getting all of our information. Everything is getting built and installed as expected. All these crazy things that are off to the races. And you know what? I did a boo-boo. Let's just go ahead and let's just grab that. Don't save. So remember how I said whenever you do this, it's going to cause some issues. So let's go ahead and save that. And if I do a poetry install now, I'm expecting for it to yell at me about the lock file. And so we can see that things are out of date. I did some terrible things. So let's go ahead and issue a poetry lock. So let's relock this. So we should be good to go. I was wondering why my dependency resolution took no time at all earlier. All right, now let's redo our poetry install command. All right, now we're installed. We're good to go. All right. So let's do a poetry shell. So this is going to activate the virtual environment for me. I don't have to know where the virtual environment is or anything from that standpoint. Um, yeah, that matches, so we're good to go on the virtual environment that's tied to my VS Code session. So now that I have installed Nautobot, I should have the Nautobot server command available for me. So let's go ahead, and before we even get off to the races, there's a couple things that we're going to need to do. Let's first run our migration. So we're going to do Nautobot server migrate. I even got ahead of myself on that one. So let's go ahead and let's generate our Nautobot config file. So instead of having to go to the repo, pull an example, copy it over, make changes, we'll just do Nautobot server init. And so over here to the left, we'll see a Nautobot config file that just magically appeared. And as I had mentioned before, we see Nautobot DB user, DB name, DB password. We see allowed hosts. We'll see some Redis stuff, as our Redis stuff is going to get pulled in by the parse Redis. And all that fun stuff, so all the stuff that I needed to override is going to be coming from this file right here, from these environment variables. So we should be able to go up and migrate. And we see we're off to the races, that we're applying our migrations. So the cool thing about Django is that Django is managing your underlying database schema as Python code. And you're not having to understand or know, okay, I have to write all these different select statements or anything like that. And also Django does a really great job with item potency and knowing when it needs to make to push a migration, which we'll get into that whenever we are actually creating our models. But if we go an up arrow and hit migrate again, no migrations to apply. So we're good to go. So now if we wanted to, we can do Nautobot server, run server. And so by default, the run server is just going to run single threaded. It's going to run on local hosts exposing to 8,000. And so if don't go away. I'm over here and I go to my bad gateway and I refresh, I'm good to go. But hey, I never created a user. So if I go here and go login, default admin, I don't have anything. And so let's go ahead and let's create a user real quick. So to create super user, we're going to do admin, don't need an email, admin. So we got this super secret user called admin with the password of admin. Super awesome. So now if I refresh this, it's going to work. No, I don't want to do that. I just want to go back here. Nope, not going to work because it didn't restart the service. So whenever I did a control C, I actually shut down that process and it's not running in the background. It's not running with UWizKey or anything like that. Like I said, we're running this as a development environment. This is not meant to show you how to set up a production Nautobot server, but how you can build a development environment for creating your own Nautobot plugin. So let's go back up here. Let's do run server. So back up and going. Here, now I can go back to my login, admin, admin. Cool. Nope, don't care. Nope, don't care. All right, so we can see that we're logged in. We have nothing in here. And if we come over to our admin panel within Nautobot and we go to install plugins, we don't have anything that's installed. So cool. This is exactly what we're expecting. We have a complete plain Jane vanilla out of the box Nautobot environment that doesn't have anything installed. Now, if I wanted to try and browse to this underlying instance on port 8000, like I said, it's running in the local development environment with run server. It's running on port 8000. Am I going to be able to hit it? No taco. There's a reason why I'm not able to hit it. And if we come back here and we take a peek at the run server, we'll see that we're getting it on localhost port 8000. So if I wanted to, I could do run server. Yes, I know you can expose that to me. I don't care. So run server on quad 0. So accepting all inbound connections from any IP, and we're going to be running on port 8000. And we'll see now that it's HTTP quad 0 8000, and automatically Chrome saw, hey, I'm now able to make a connection here, so let's go ahead and spin that up. And you can see that since this is technically a different URL, the session state does not persist between these two environments. The reason behind that is we're using two different URL patterns. We have nautobot.writej6 versus ubuntu-server.writej6. So if we go ahead and click login, if I could type, there we go. No. Go back to admin, install plugins. We're off to the races. So far, all we've done is, like I said, set up a development version of Nautobot in a local environment using virtual environments to run the Nautobot process itself and getting a default Nautobot config file. And like I said, wanting to make sure that we stay as close to vanilla as possible. And like I mentioned, if I wanted to, I could come into the Nautobot config file and I could start monkeying around and changing how I'm pulling in all of my stuff from databases to allowed hosts or overriding any of the vars that are here. But I don't want to do that. I am preferring to just let it stay as vanilla as possible and only changing what I absolutely need to change. So next there's going to be a couple things that we need to create inside of our init.py to be able to have Nautobot understand and know where our plugin is going to be. So let's come back over here. So I don't care about my live stream. We don't care about that anymore. Don't care about that. Don't care about that. So I don't care about, yes, I do care about that. So if we look inside here, inside of our actual Python package, we have the Nautobot plugin, IP range, and then an init.py. This init.py is the default init.py that was created by Django, by Poetry for me out of the box, not something that I created myself. So what we're going to have to do, because Nautobot, when it's attempting to load a plugin, it's going to be looking for specific things within the init.py file. So let's go ahead and do a from nautobot.extras.plugins import plugin config. So we're going to we're going to subclass the plugin config and override a couple of the class level attributes. So we have our version. So let's do class stream plugin. And the name of our class that we're subclassing from, it doesn't necessarily matter. It should be something that makes sense, and if you look at it, you can understand what it is. But outside of this file, I'm not really going to be using this for anything else at this time. So we're going to be subclassing from plugin config. So let's do a couple things. Let's set the name. So our name is going to be Nautobot plugin IP range. We're going to do a verbose name, and that's going to be Nautobot plugin to model IP ranges. The author is going to be J6, so my GitHub handle. Description. My super cool stream plugin where I modeled IP ranges. So the base URL. So if you do not specify the base URL is going to be coming from what the project is. So it's going to be Nautobot plugin IP range. But I don't really care to have a super long base URL. And I'll be getting into that just in later sessions around how this base URL is coming into play and what that full URL pattern looks like. But I am going to go ahead and override it and say base URL is IP range. Required settings. So we're not really going to be using any required settings. If there is something that you wanted to ensure it was being set by your end user and it had to be there no matter what. So if it's match IP range size, if let's say we wanted to enforce that as a standard, there is a plugin config stanza within the Nautobot config file that we would overload that and we'd say specify those settings there. And the specific keys that we specify in required settings is what's going to be referencing that. And I can show that in a moment. So let's say we had a required setting of foo. We'd be looking for that foo key inside of plugin config. So we also can do default settings. So let's say we wanted to make sure that there's always foo, and foo is going to be bar. So essentially, if the underlying user did not specify this in the plugin config for this specific plugin, it's going to get defaulted to bar. So if I wanted to override that in my plugin config, I could do foo equals baz inside the dictionary, and it would overwrite that. Otherwise, it would fall back to foo equals bar. But again, we're not going to be doing anything with overloading of those bars in this go around. We might do some fun stuff later, but we're not going to be doing that today. So next, we're going to be off to the races doing specifying our min version. So I wanted to make sure that I'm taking advantage of some of the features that may be potentially exposed in certain versions. So the latest minor release that's out right now is 1.1. And I am going to have a bit of confidence that everything I'm using in 1.1 is probably going to be available in 1.x. So any of the minor releases in 1.1. But I'm not sure if there's anything that may or may not be compatible with 1.0. So I'm just going to start this plugin saying this is going to be compatible with 1.1 going forward. Just kind of a personal preference on my end on that side. And then to specify the max version, basically I'm just saying that this is an easy way of specifying that anything that is 1.1.0 or greater, or I'm sorry, and 1.999 or less. So basically, essentially saying if it's less than 2 or greater than 1.1. And then caching config. So if we're overloading any of the caching config specific to our underlying plugin. So after we've specified our subclass of the plugin config, we need to specify a variable called config. And config is basically all we're going to be doing is passing in stream plugin. So whenever Nautobot is starting up and it's looking for these specific plugins, it's going to be looking for the config attribute of this module and passing back the stream plugin, which is subclass of the plugin config. So if I come back over here and I go back to my admin panel and I look at installed plugins, nope, still don't have a plugin just yet. All right, so why don't I have a plugin just yet? I've not told Nautobot about it. So let's come over to our Nautobot config file. And so let's go ahead and do a find. It makes it easier. I'm going to specify, yep, that actually worked. I'm going to specify plugin, Nautobot plugin IP range, which is the name of my plugin. And like I mentioned earlier, if I wanted to, I could come here to plugin config. And I could override those variables here if I needed to. But like I said, we're not going to be working with anything from the plugin config. But this is how, if you're needing to pass in specific bars to your plugin configuration, this is where you would do it here. It makes it a lot easier and cleaner versus doing a bunch of OS environs to get specific configuration items throughout all of your code and repeating the same function call of OS environ everywhere. Otherwise, you can just place it one time in here inside of your plugin config, and then you can just reference that from your subsequent code using Django settings .plugin config. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. We're good to go. Now, one thing that we have noticed is that we are not refreshing here. So why aren't we refreshing? Well, the reason why we're not refreshing is that the plugins that Nautobot is looking for are done based off of start time of the Nautobot service. So if I do a Control-C and I go up, and I start my run server, and I take a look, we'll see that all of a sudden I've got these py caches that are appearing up on my plugin. And then now my expected behavior is if I come here and I refresh, holy moly, I've got my plugin. But like I said, we're not all the way done. This is just getting your development environment set up, getting that base plugin created. And what's this whole base URL that we're talking about? So we can see that we don't have anything for navigation just yet. If I come here, I do plugins, and I do IP range, which is what my base URL would be, and I hit enter, I get a full report because I haven't implemented anything yet. So as of right now, this is as far as we're going with today's stream. Like I said, this is just to get our development environment up and going, not necessarily to go through and create everything and get all of the moving parts of the machine for creating our models, creating our view sets, creating our migrations, creating the UI. This is just our base introduction. Perfect. All right, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, same place, different URL, but similar. Same YouTube channel to talk about creating our base models and what we need to do some basic testing with that. So it's been a pleasure, and